Mosar ha'av l'shluchei habal harehi b'rshus habal v'chulei. The Mishnah described that if the emissaries of the father give her over to emissaries of the husband, she's considered in their domain. And she's considered in the husband's domain. On the side, we have a nosei mivneh heading, and as you scan the Gemara, you'll notice triangles appear. In fact, 4 in number. These are deois alma hatotzos shel mosar av l'shluchei habal. Different opinions as to what results when we say that as a result of the father giving over the daughter to the shluchei habal, she's considered in the Baal's domain. What are the results of this? Omar Rav is the first opinion. He says Mesirasa la kol chutz mitruma. Truma. When we say that she's given over to the husband's domain, she's considered in the husband's domain with regard to everything except for the eating of truma. Ravasi Omar afle truma, and Ravasi says even for truma. We must provide a little more background to this issue than just the translation of the Gemara, and we do so by looking into the Rashi. Chutz me'achilas truma, the taima dida, the reason for this idea of a woman who, though is married on a Torah level to this man, she's married to a Kohen. And the Torah says that a Kohen who acquires slaves, acquires a wife. His acquisitions are entitled to eat from Truma. So on a purely Torah level, one would expect the Arusa to be entitled to Truma. And yet we're saying all along, no, not so. She doesn't eat from Truma at that point. Why not? So there are actually 2 opinions as to why that is. Rashi continues, Mishum Simpon. Simpon is a word meaning something that undoes. On a more practical level, Simpon will say means a blemish. The husband discovers a blemish, a bodily blemish on his wife, something that he did not expect. Ve'akanti iko lemechash lahachi shemo yimtzu ba mumin. The girl has been given over to whom? To the shluchei habal. Are we going to let her eat truma? When she eventually reaches the husband, he might discover on her these blemishes, and he'll say that I didn't intend to marry a woman with blemishes like this. And that would then reveal that the initial Kiddushin and certainly the Nisuin was all one big mistake, and that retroactively she was never married to a Kohen. So how would things look if in the meantime she was eating Truma, something to which she was not entitled whatsoever? So that helps to explain why Rav says she is not entitled to Truma, even though she's entitled to everything else we described earlier as characteristic being Birshus Habal, not to Truma, because of the Chashash of Simpon. Rav Asi, on the other hand, said she's entitled to eating from Truma at this point in time, that Mosar Av L'Shluchei Habal, she's no longer in her father's domain. Physically speaking, she's no longer in her father's house. She's been removed from there. Why does Rav Asi say that she's entitled to eating from Truma? Because Rav Asi, in his whole approach to the Arusa not eating from Truma that we mentioned earlier, was a different reason for that. Not because of the Chashash Simpon, that the fear of the tos, the retroactive undoing of the marriage, but rather, as long as she's still in her father's house physically, imagine she would receive a bottle of Truma wine. Is there not a fear that maybe she'll share the wine with her brothers, with other members of her family that are not kohanim, sure, that's a fear. That's called Shema Yimzigula Kais Beveis Aviyah. We're afraid she'll fill up a cup of truma wine in her father's house. Rashi says, I'm reading from the Rashi, he points that out under the second triangle that you can see in the Rashi. But once the father has given her over to the agents, the emissaries of her husband, the Kohen, there's no longer any fear of that. So while they're in the limousine driving with her to her new husband, and they want to uncork a bottle of fine truma wine, so there's nothing wrong, no reason for her not to partake of it. That's Rav Asi's approach. Now I'm going to skip. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit over here, but hopefully this will benefit us later in the Gemara. We've read so far the two first triangles, Rav and Rav Asi. There are more triangles that come along the way. Later in the Gemara, a little less, almost halfway down, you'll see on the side there's a long bracket marking. So on the first one online is Litruma. Then there's a Meisvei. Meisvei introduces a question. It's from a rather long Tanaic source. Most of the Tanaic source you'll see is bracketed off. We'll skip the bracketed section initially, and you'll notice it leads us to a line ending with the word litruma, and we would read litruma. Ein isha oicheles betruma ad shetikones lechuppah. A woman is not entitled to eat from truma until she enters the chuppah. Tiyufta de kulhu. And the Gemara at that point will say this source represents a refutation of all. And when you learn the Rashi and the Tosfos, especially the Tosfos, the Tufta de Kulu, even though Kulu is a term in the plural, nevertheless it's really a focus on Rav Asi's opinion. Rav Asi said that even though she is simply with the Shluchei Abal, Rav Asi says she's entitled to truma, even though she hasn't entered nisuin yet. This Tanaic source says she's not entitled to truma until nisuin. So this source represents a tiyufta to anyone who would say that she is entitled to truma prior to the actual nisuin, the actual chuppah. That's as far as superstructure of the upcoming section of Gemara. Of course, we have a lot more to do until we get to that. We just read Rav Asi's opinion regarding the father giving her over to the Shluchei Habal, and we're talking about a Baal who is a Kohen. Rav Asi says she's entitled to Truma as well. And now we have a smaller bracketed section. If you skip the bracketed section, you see Ushmuel Omar L'Yerushasa. She's considered in the husband's domain with regard to a husband's right to inherit her if she dies en route. If she dies en route, she would be entitled to inheriting the nedunya, the dowry that she brought into the marriage. Now, Rashi points out under Shmuel, but with regard to truma and other things, she is not entitled to it. So that Shmuel will go along with Rav in that sense, not for truma purposes. But she's considered in the domain of the husband for Yerusha purposes. If we look at Rashi, a few lines down from here, Shmuel Amar Yerushasa, Hu de Mahanya Mesira, the giving over from the father to the husband emissaries is of consequence. She Mesa Baderech, if she dies en route, Baal Yoresh Nedun Yasa, the husband is entitled to inherit the Nidunya. Those are the properties that the father had assigned to his daughter in anticipation of her marriage. Even though it has been taught, Ishto Arusa Mesa Eino Yorsha, then when an Arusa dies, the husband does not inherit her. Hachakiva de Mosra, here, since the father gave her over, Achuli Achil Av Mehashta Machmas Kiruv Nisuin. The father is foregoing, is forfeits, so to speak, his claim on those properties simply because she has achieved Kiruv Nisuin, the closeness or the bonding of the Nisuin. In other words, this is what the Mesira accomplishes, a type of, let's say, a quasi Nisuin. In other words, she's no longer considered a straightforward Arusa, which would have stated Eino Yorsha. But here, at this point, yes, Yorsha. This concept, by the way, of Kiruv Nisuin, I think we saw that reflected before in the concept of Mishum Ichtuni. It's a concept. I don't know in terms of being very exact in the comparisons. That I wouldn't say, because there the source was speaking about Erusin. Here we're speaking about a stage slightly beyond Erusin, but nevertheless, this concept of a father being happy with his daughter achieving marital status, you can see that is a factor, something that we saw before back on Mem Zayin and Beis. But here, we're being very, very specific, very, very focused in pointing out different stages. We're dealing with something just beyond strict Erusin. She's been given over to the husband's emissaries. So as far as Shmuel is concerned, this is the time at which, from this point on, the husband would be entitled to inherit properties that the father had dedicated toward his daughter's marriage. But, and we're emphasizing, as Rashi says, Shmuel is not saying that she's entitled, that at this point she would be entitled to Truma. That, not so. Reish Lakish is a fourth approach, and we did skip brackets. We're not forgetting that. We'll get back to that momentarily. But Reish Lakish Amar Liksubasa, the Mesira from the father to the Shluchei Abal is a reference to the Ksuba. What exactly that means, the Gemara will have to deal with. That's not clear yet. Let's go back over the bracketed section. We had seen Rav Asi, who said that the giving over to the husband's emissaries is, for all intents and purposes, now she is in the rishus of the Baal, even for eating Truma. Within the bracketed section, you'll see there's an attempt to ask on Rav Asi, but Rav, ironically speaking, Rav is doche that attempt. I say ironically because Rav himself disagrees with Rav Asi, but you'll see a certain level of honesty in the Shas, that when you ask a question on your adversary, even though he is your adversary, you want to make sure that the question is not something the adversary can easily reject. If it is so, it doesn't benefit you at all. Eisvei Rav Huna l'Ravasi v'Amri lo. Another version is Chio barav l'Ravasi. There are two versions of who's asking on Ravasi. The first version has Rav Huna. Rav Huna is a student of Rav. The second version is the son of Rav. Chio barav is asking on Ravasi. The source says, Li oilam he birshus ha'av ad shetikones lechupa. She is considered in the father's domain until entrance to the marriage canopy. And when you say l'oilam, the implication is regarding truma consumption as well. that she's not entitled because her father is a non-Kohen. Making that, of course, that's the assumption. The father is a non-Kohen. She is marrying a Kohen. She's considered in the father's domain with regard to truma consumption, namely prohibited in truma consumption until entrance to marriage canopy. What did Rav Asi say about it? Rav Asi said, no, even before the chuppah, as long as she's given to the emissaries of the husband, she is, yes, entitled to truma. So that's the question that was posed against Rav Asi. Omar Luhu Rav. Rav says to them, namely either to Rav Huna, his student, or to his son, Chia. He says, Lava Mina Lahu, didn't I tell you, Lo Tezlu Boser Ibcha, don't pursue or don't follow things that can be flipped around. In other words, don't ask questions from sources that he could easily turn around and actually use to support his own point of view. Yachol Lishniya Lahu, he, Rav Asi, could tell you that Mesirasa Zu Hi Knisasa L'chuppah, that her being given over to the husband's emissaries is the equivalent, is her entrance to the marriage canopy. That's a form of chuppah. The term chuppah we often translate as marriage canopy, but it represents a halachic concept as well. So that her being given over to the husband's emissaries is the equivalent of chuppah. And then the source is saying that, well, she's entitled to truma at the point she's given over to the emissaries of the husband, and that is exactly what Rav Asi would like you to believe. So the question that was attempted here in the brackets on Rav Asi, you can see, is rejected. We go on now with the third opinion as to what is accomplished when we say Mosar Av l'shluchei Baal u'Shmuel Omar liYerushasa, for inheritance purposes. And we went through the Rashi that we mentioned, that Rashi described that as the Nedunya property that the father had assigned to his daughter in anticipation of her marriage. If she dies en route, the husband will be entitled to those things. However, Rashi adds, as we alluded to orally before, but if we let's look together at the continuation of the Rashi. We're looking at Rashi that you'll find pretty much in the middle of the Rashi column, under the Dibur Masel Shmuel Lishasa, halfway down into that Rashi, you'll see Avol L'Truma. There's a squiggle underlined Avol. Rashi says Avol L'Truma U'Laforas Nidorel Shelo B'Shutfis. However, regarding her rights to Truma and the father's or the husband's, let's say, the husband's ability to annul her vows in an exclusive fashion without the father accompanying him, Ulamitziasa, and the rights to her items that she finds, Di'ena Ela Mishum Eva, the reason that the found items are transferred over is that she doesn't keep the found items is simply to prevent ill feelings. Vakati lekolamechash. This idea of Eva isn't present yet. Lo mahanyo masira ki chuppah. Regarding those things that, let's say, the husband should be entitled to things she finds, that doesn't apply yet. The masira is not the equivalent of chuppah regarding those things, regarding a husband's exclusive rights to annul her vows, regarding the eating of truma that she would receive in merit of marrying a Kohen. And as we said, the items that she finds, they don't go to the husband yet. But as far as inheriting the Nedunya, if she dies en route, the husband is entitled to that. We continue in the Gemara. Reish Lakish Amar L'Ksubasa. The Mesira, the giving over, helps with benefit to the Ksuba. We have a small bracketed section. On the side, we have a double-starred note. Achrei Sograyim, after the bracketed section, Muva Hapirush L'divrei Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish just said, L'ksasa, if you skip the brackets, you see the Gemara's explanation of that. Besocha Sograyim, within the brackets, a Gemara mitkashe lahavin kavanoso shereish Lakish. The Gemara expresses its difficulty in understanding what is Reish Lakish trying to say. We go back now to the Gemara. Reish Lakish said that the Mesira helps the Kesubos. If we skip the brackets, you can see the answers. Lomar Kesubos me'acher mona. It means that if the husband to be, after she was given to his emissaries, if that husband dies before they actually consummate their marriage, she is considered a widow, but a widow from Nisuin. And if she marries another man, she is entitled to a ksuba only of 100, as is the case of an almona from Nisuin. This is in contrast to a woman who became an almona from a state of Erusin, and she's still a virgin, and she's an almana from Erusin, that would entitle her to a ksuba of 200. But the Mesira to the husband's emissaries makes her considered a Nesu'ah with regard to the amount of ksuba she'd be entitled to upon her marrying a second man in the event that the husband dies at this early point in time. Let's go over now the bracketed section. Reish Lakish Omar L'Kesubos, that the Mesira to the Shluchei HaBaal is beneficial for being considered in the Reshus of the Baal for Ksuba purposes. Kesubos Mahi. What do you mean by Ksuba? Di'i Mesa Yorisla. Do you mean that, does Reish Lakish mean that if she dies at this point, that she was merely transferred to the Shluchei HaBaal, that husband will inherit the Nidunya that the father had assigned to her? Well, Hainu de Shmuel, that's exactly what Shmuel said when he said the Yerushasa. So Reish Lakish it doesn't need to just repeat that what Shmuel said. Omar Ravino explains what Reish Lakish really meant. Loimar Kesubos me'acher mona. That once she is given over to the Shluchei HaBaal, at that point in time, if that Baal dies before she ever reaches him, physically reaches him, she nevertheless is considered an almona from Nisuin. And that if she marries someone else, that's the Kesubos me'acher. Me'acher is a second husband. Mona would be only 100. Rabbi Yochanan v'Rabbi Chanina the Amri Travayu Mesirasa lakol af l'truma. Well, you have more opinions that line up with Ravasi. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina, they say the Mesira to the Shluchei HaBaal entitles her even to eat from Truma. Meisvei. And then, as we did before, but we'll do it again, we have a Tanaic source, a lot of information in the middle that will be dealt with later by the Gemara, but if we skip the bracketed section, use your bracket length indicator, you come to a point at which it says, L'truma, eini shochelis b'truma ad shetikones l'chuppah. Tiyufta b'kulhu. This source is saying she's not entitled to truma until she physically enters the chuppah. This would be a repudiation or a refutation of all those that had, let's say, had agreed or had said what they did, like Rav Asi. So you have Rav Asi it becomes problematic here, and we have Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina who indicate that she could eat from truma even prior to chuppah, and this says that that's not the case. This is a problem for them. Meisvei. We will be seeing a number of details in this Tanaic source that the Gemara will relate to later on. But as we already demonstrated with the brackets, we have the immediate agenda is to get to the question that, as Tosfos says, is directed at all those who said that the Mesira is effective even to enable her to eat Truma, and from this source we are to see not so. With all that having been said, we go now within the brackets. Holach ho'av im shluchei habal, o shaholchu shluchei ho'av im shluchei habal. These are cases that we saw in the Mishnah, where the father is, say, still in the picture. He's going with the husband's emissaries along with his daughter, or the father's emissaries are going along with the husband's emissaries. Oy shehoisa lo chotzer baderech. The markings that you see here are necessary for the Gemara later on. On the side, you can see under the Mivneh, you see a diamond. Hadgoshas lo velo. Words that are emphasized by the diamond. L'tzarech ha-Gemara l'kamon. It's necessary for the Gemara later on. The dashed underlining is hadgoshas nichnesa imoy shemafia bereisha b'seifa. These expressions appear in both parts of the source as well. So the third scenario is shahoisa lo chotzer baderech v'nichnesa imoy lolin. Or the girl has a courtyard en route, and she goes with him to rest, lolin, to sleep, to rest. We should point out, let's glance at Rashi momentarily. We're looking at the last third of the Rashi commentary. V'nichneso imo im bailo. You know, this case involves the father is still in the picture, it seems, and she goes with the husband into this chotzer, kishar lina baderech ba'alma v'lo l'shem nisuin. She goes into this chotzer, into this courtyard for resting purposes, but not for nisuin purposes, and that's what we have to emphasize as far as the father's presence here. Yes or no, that I'm not committing myself to either way, but what is clear is that she goes with the husband. Now we're talking about a man that was ma'ares her. He had entered the first stage of marriage, and they go into this chotzer for resting purposes. Afal pi shekesubos beveis baila, even though the articles that have been dedicated toward her dowry, Rashi says, metaltalin shichet avil l'nidun yasa. These are portables, these are items of value that her father dedicated to his daughter upon her marriage to the husband. Mesa, if she dies at this point, aviha yorsha, her father will inherit. So in these cases 1 and 2 and 3, you see that in cases 1 and 2 it's very clear that the father is still in the picture, and in case 3 we said that she went into her courtyard for resting purposes only. That's not considered nisuin. They went in only for resting purposes. If she dies, she's basically dying as an arusa, and as such, the father inherits her. We continue. Mosar ho'av l'shluchei habal, o shemosar shluchei av l'shluchei habal. Again, familiar cases where the father gave her over to the husband's emissaries, or the emissaries of the father gave her over to the husband's emissaries. Father is no longer in the picture. Or the husband had a courtyard en route to their home, to the husband's house. and she goes into this courtyard for nisuin purposes. Even if the articles of value are still in her father's house, Mesa, if she dies at this point, Bailo Yorsha, the husband will inherit her. So you have a case of Mesira, as we saw, and this, by the way, is very similar to what Shmuel had said above. Bamed v'mamurim, when does this Mesira to the Shluchim be considered Nisuin? Liyerushasa. It's only for Yerusha purposes. And here, this is a very clear qualification. Avolitruma ein isha chelis betruma ad shetikanes lechuppah. This is very clear than a problem for Ravasi, and what Rav had commented on earlier cannot be. Rav, if you recall before, says that when you see tikanes l'chuppah, you can interpret that as mesira to the shluchei habal. But here, the source is very clear, not agreeing with that interpretation for this source. As far as this source is concerned, mesira l'shluchim is not considered the chuppah with regard to truma. Tiyufta Kulhu Tiyufta. So that this source, by its conclusion, let's read the last two lines of the source again. Bamed v'mamurim. When do we say that the Mesira to the Shluchim of the Baal is considered Nisuin? That's with regard to inheritance purposes. As far as truma eating is concerned, a woman does not eat from truma until she enters an actual marriage canopy, not a courtyard. It seems to be saying you're not a courtyard of his. That's l'shem nisuin, right? That we have to discuss a little bit further later on. But certainly, as Rashi directs the discussion, that the Bamed Vamurim is a qualification concerning the Mesira to the Shluchim is not considered Nisuin for Truma purposes. That having been said, the Gemara concludes, Tiyufta Dekulu, this is a refutation of all those that said that she is entitled to Truma purposes, like Ravasi, like Rabbi Yochanan, like Rabbi Chanina. The way Rashi presents it, this is a refutation of all those who disagreed with Shmuel. Shmuel said that the giving over to the Shluchim is for Yerusha purposes, and that's what this source says, not for other things, as Shmuel had indicated through Rashi's interpretation, and hence this is a tiyufta to all of those. At this point, the Gemara analyzes the source itself. It says, the Gemara says, Ha gufa kasha. This source it presents to us an inherent problem. Amris nichnesa imololin. Notice the arrow that we have here, and it lines you up with the quote from above. It said that if she went together with the husband into her chotzer for resting purposes, that it's not considered as if she entered the husband's domain. Taima delolin. Well, the reason is because their interest was simply for resting purposes, was clearly for resting purposes. Hostama, if they went in for some undefined reason, they simply went in, not for an expressed purpose of resting from the journey, but they stam. Stam means in an unqualified, undefined entrance to that chotzer. Well, then we would conclude, hastama, it's l'shein nisuin, it's tantamount to nisuin. Nisuin being the consummation of the marriage would be accomplished then and there. Emo seifa, well then can state the continuation of the source. Nichnesa imo l'shein nisuin. We saw that in the case that he had a chotzer, and they went in for nisuin purposes. Ha-stama, we would infer that if it was for some undefined reason, not a specified nisuin purpose, but stama, that would be lolin. That would be like the equivalent of going in for resting and not accomplish anything. So that when you look at this entrance to Chatzeros in a stam, in an undefined or unstated, for an unstated purpose, we would seem to have a contradiction. The inference from the Reisha led us to say that stam is l'shem nisuin, and the inference from the Seifa indicates stama is not l'shem nisuin. Omar Ravashi. Ravashi explains, stami kotoni. There are two cases of stam, but there are two different circumstances that now we will emphasize. Remember, we had the diamonds above. There was her chotzer, and then there's his chotzer. So Ravashi says, stami kotoni. There are two cases of stam that are taught here. Stam chotzer dida equals lolin. If they go into her chotzer, it's property that she owns. Without any defined reason, you can assume that it means lolin. Not as we thought before, that they went in there with a stated purpose of lolin, but rather they went in without any defined purpose. We will say that that does not constitute nisuin, because the stam chotzer of her stam chotzer en route would be for simple resting purposes. However, stam chotzer didei, entering a piece of property, a chotzer, a courtyard that he owns, that's located en route to his house, and they go into his property without any defined purpose, you can rest assured that is l'nisuin. Let's take a look at the Rashi. Stami kotoni, on the last narrow line of the Rashi commentary. Ha de kotoni nichnasa imo lalun. The section of the source in the Reisha that said she entered for resting purposes. Lo shepirsha lalunani nichneses v'lo l'shem nisuin. It's not as if she announced, let's go in here to rest and not for nisuin purposes. The Hadikotani Nichnasa Ima Nisuin, and the Seifa that says she went in for Nisuin, Lo Shapir Shal Nisuni Nichneses, said let's go in to finally consummate our marriage. Ela Zu Vizu Shenichnaso Stam. In both cases, they entered without any expressed reason or goal. The Tanu de Komar, and it's the Tana that is telling us the Hecha de Chotzer Shalom, that if you're dealing with her courtyard, Stam Knisasa Lo Nisuin. Their undefined entrance is for sure not for Nisuin. Ela Lalun, they're simple, they're undefined, unstated entrances to rest. The Hecha de Chotzer Shalom, but if it's his courtyard, Stam Knisasa L'Shem Nisuin, you can assume that the undefined entrance on her part to his chotzer with him is for nisuin purposes, for consummating their marriage, and with all that implies. We turn back to the Gemara text. Tana. There's a little note that we have on the side. Afapi shelo simanu ezeh with a triangle. Mispar chamesh. What we're about to read, we're not listing this as a number 5. Mikol mokom zu od gisha l'toitza shel mesiras ha'av l'shluchei ba'al. This represents another result of what happens when the father gives the daughter over to the husband's emissaries. That, of course, was the focus, the discussion of the first 4 triangles. So, in that sense, this is a continuation of that theme. Tana Mosar Av L'Shluchei Baal. If once the father gives his daughter over to the husband's emissaries, Vizinsa. If at that point she has an illicit act of intimacy, Harei zu bechenek. she's viewed as a nisu'ah, and her punishment, her form of execution is chenek, which is strangulation, which is the execution given to a nisu'ah, and not stoning, which is the form of execution that would be administered to an arusa. Mino hanimili. What's the basis for this? Omar of Ami, Bar Hamo, Omar Kro. The pasuk regarding stoning says, Liznoi Space Avia, that the stoning is given when znus was violated in the context of her father's home. Prat, this is to the exclusion l'shemosarav l'shluchei habal. That already, where the father gave her over to the husband's emissaries, she's not called Beis Ovi anymore, and hence no skila. There's a house marking that appears under the Mivneh heading. They highlight Shnei She'elos Shenish'alos, Shtei She'elos, two questions Shenish'alos that are raised Ekev Mashikotoni Bebraisa, in light of that which we just learned in this source Tana Mosar Ha'av that we just learned. So the Gemara, V'ema Prat Shenifnesa L'chupa V'lo Nivala. When we want to say that we have a pasuk Liznois Beis Avia, who is to say that Liznos Beis Avia is coming to exclude from skila the scenario of her being given over to husband's emissaries? Maybe she's still considered a straightforward arusa at that point. And if you want to know what the pasuk is coming to exclude, it's coming to exclude from skila this case, which is very close to nisuin. She went into the marriage canopy, but he hasn't had intimacy with her yet. That at that point, even though he hasn't had actual intimacy with her, but once she enters the marriage canopy, then she loses her let's say arusa / skila status. That's the case that's excluded. But if she's only given over to the shluchei habal, she would still be a candidate, or should be still susceptible to the skila execution if she had znus. There's a Rashi that we'll look at together, 5 lines from the bottom. V'ema prat l'shenichnesa l'cheshenichnesa l'chupa v'lo niva. Dayoch, it's enough. Imiatita kagon zu, that this case alone we will exclude from skila. The lo tema, that you shouldn't think nara besula ksiv gabi skila vo akati besula havoi, that in the context of skila you see that the Torah describes a virgin as a nara, that she's between 12 and 12 and a half, and she's also a virgin, and in fact this case of nifnas l'chupa v'lo nivla, she still is a virgin. And so here you have a chidush that even though she's still a virgin, she's still like that which the Torah describes as getting skila, she won't get skila. Avol zu, the case of Mosar Ha'av to shluchei habal she'af l'chupa lo nichnasa, she hasn't even entered a marriage canopy yet. Lo mi'ato ha'kosuf, the Torah hasn't excluded her from skila. V'akati beis avia karina bei, and we would still refer to her as being in the father's home. She would still be considered worthy or deserving of skila. The Gemara answers. Now you'll note that we have a long answer. Omar Rava. Omar li Ami. Rava tells us that Ami told him, Chuppah behedya ksiva. The idea of a girl who entered chuppah, that's nichsa v'lo nivala, that's stated explicitly that she will not get skila. So that case is already covered So then what am I going to do with Liznoi Space Aviyah? I'll have nothing left to do with it other than to say that it is coming to exclude from skila the case of Mosrav l'shluchei Baal. So that in effect both cases are really covered. It's not just nichnas chuppah v'lo nival. That's already stated explicitly as not deserving of skila. But even the case of Mosrav l'shluchei Baal also will not get skila. And here we see that the case of nichnas chuppah v'lo nivala is excluded from skila. Behedyo ksiva, it's stated explicitly. How do you see that? So we have a pasuk. Kiyeh nara b'sula merosa leish. Now this pasuk is in the context of skila. The pasuk describes who would get skila if it's a nara b'sula merosa leish. Nara v'lo bogeres. She'd have to first of all be between 12 and 12 and a half in order to deserve skila, and not a bogeres. Bogeres is above 12 and a half. Besula v'lo be'ula. She'd have to be a virgin, not having had intimacy already. Me'irasa v'lo nesua. My nesua. When you say she has to be categorized as a me'irasa, as erusin, and not a nesua, what do you mean when you say not a nesua? Ilema nesua mamish. Literally nesua. That means that she had the marriage canopy and also had intimacy with her husband. Hainu basula. She's already excluded from the word basula, which says that skila is given only if she's an actual virgin. But if she were nichnas chuppah and nivala, so she's already excluded by basula. I don't need the word me'orasa to exclude that. So let's read that again. I leimon nisua mamish hainu basula velo beula. That is already covered by the exclusion before from the word basula, which meant basula not a beula. Elolav. So what does ma'orasa indicate? Ma'orasa means ma'orasa gets skila, but not someone else. Elolav shenichnas lechuppah velo nivala. If she merely entered the marriage canopy without the subsequent intimacy with her husband, still she will not get skila. Not only if she had the intimacy, even if she didn't have the intimacy, even though technically speaking she's still a besula, she nevertheless is not a candidate for skila. And that's what we meant before when we said that nichnas chuppah v'lo nivala is excluded from skila b'feirush by the presence of this word me'orasa. So fine, me'orasa or nichnas chuppah v'lo nivala does not get skila from the word me'orasa. What does the pasuk of Liznois Beis Aviyah communicate? That tells us that even if she was merely transferred from the father to the husband's emissaries, she too, if she was mizana at that point, will not be subject to skila. Now, you'll notice that we have a semicolon that indicates that as we continue, we're continuing, but not in a continuous, let's say, direct train of thought, but nevertheless, a similar, a question in light of that which we've learned in the source of Mosrav l'shluchei Baal. Another question in that general context is being raised. It's a new question, and Rashi makes a point of that in his commentary. V'ema, let us suggest heicha de hadra lebei nasha, hadra lemilsa kamaisa. Rashi at the top, Hochi Garsino Ve'ema Heicha Dehadra Lebei Nasha Tehadra Lemilsa Kamaisa. If she were to return to her father's house, Bei Nasha means her father's house. Mi Havyo Kamisha Lo Nimsara. Would it be then in our halachic approach be as if she was never given over? Does her return, let's say she backs out, from the father had given over to Shluchei Baal, and then she goes back home. Would you say that that's as if she was never given over? Rashi says, Bayo bi almi. It's a general kind of question. It's not a serious question. Elo, it's not a serious question in so far as our questioning text or facts. Elo dikotoni masnisin. We were taught harehi birshus habal, that when you have mosra ha'av l'shluchei habal, the Mishnah said she is considered in the reshus of the Baal. Umashma, when you say she's considered in the domain of the husband, it seems afilu chozra min haderech lebeis avia, even if she were to go back while en route, she would go back to her father's house. Kfar yotzim reshus ha'av, she's considered as having left the father's domain. V'kevon delo nafgalon mesiras shluchin elo mikro yisera de beis avia. Since this whole concept of being given over to emissaries is something derived from an extra expression, we saw Lizno's beis avia, that beis avia expression. Ema, there leaves me room to think heicha dehadra, that where she does go back to her father's house, meaning that when she is in the reshus of these shluchim, alright, she's not called beis avia anymore. And we mentioned that if she would have znus at that point, she wouldn't get skila. But let's say she actually went back to her father's house. Karinon beis avia karinon bei. We would call that beis avia vim zin sotei b'skila. And if she would have znus now that she returned and physically to her father's house, she would be subject to the penalty of stoning if she would have znus. Don't make any mistake. When we say she goes back, it doesn't mean she's getting divorced from her Erusin state. She's still an arusa. She just went back to her father's house. Does that undo her having been given over to the shluchei habal? The Gemara answers, and note that we have a long answer here. Omar Rava, Hahu, Kvar Poska Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel. The question you're posing has been resolved already by a Tanaic source taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael. And so as not to keep you in suspense, the answer that this source tells us is that she does not undo. She doesn't go back to her original beis avia status, even though she physically went back to the house. The Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel. The pasuk says, "V'neder almona ugrusha kol asher osra al nafshi yokum aleh." Translated, the vow of a widow or of a divorcee, anything she takes upon herself, she must be fulfilled. Yokum aleh, the vow takes hold. Ma talmud lomar. What is the point of teaching this? The idea of yokum aleh, that that the vow takes hold. It's obvious that the vow takes hold. There's no one to undo it. Ma talmud lomar. What do I have to tell you? Yokum aleh, that it takes hold. V'halo mutzeis michlal av. She's out of the father's domain. Mutzeis michlal bal, and she's out of her husband's domain. These are the only people that might have been able to absolve her vows, and she's not in their domain. So why do I have to say yokum aleh? Just like we know in general vows are binding, so her vow is also binding. It's not the type of vow that's subject to absolution. Ella. So here we have to find out what is the pasuk coming to tell us. So that Rashi already introduces, and we could take a look at Rashi. Elo harei shemasa v'chulei klomar lo bo hakosav amon grushim min asuin. The pasuk isn't coming to tell me about the straightforward case of a widow or a woman divorced from the suin. That's already covered by a pasuk in Beis Isha Nedara. Isha Yafirenu Varein Isha Kayam. That's covered already by the inference from a pasuk dealing with a married woman, which says that her husband will annul or has the power to absolve or annul those vows. And if she doesn't have a husband, so then the vows are still a stick. So what do we mean? What is the pasuk here when it talks about Almana Grusha? What is it coming to teach us? So now let's go back to the Gemara text. Elo, Haresha Mosar Av L'Shluchei Habal. A father gave his daughter over to agents of the husband. Or the father's agents gave her over to the husband's agents, and she made a vow en route to the husband that's waiting for her. And he died, the husband died, or he decided to divorce her. Heich ani korei ba. How shall I relate to her? Base Avia Shelzu or base Baila Shelzu, is she considered in her father's house? Is she considered in her husband's house? Ela Lomar Loch, the pasuk tells me, Kevan Shiot Shachas Mishusav, once she left her father's domain, even for a moment, Shuv Eino Yochol Lahafir, the father can no longer absolve those vows. So what's the point? Once she leaves for a moment, that's it. Father's out of the picture. She's no longer considered Beis Avia, and therefore, with regard to the question above, if she goes back to the father's domain house after she was en route with the Shluchei Habal, and she is Mezaneh, and she's Mezaneh after she goes back to her father's house, she's not going to be considered back in his Rishus. Just like the father will not be able to annul her vows, so too the penalty of skila will no longer apply. Now, we had started learning a Rashi together. Let us pick up where we left off. You'll notice we have right across from here the dashed underlined section of the Rashi. The pasuk had mentioned Neder Almana Grusha is essentially Yokem Olea. Elo la'almona, we're talking about a widow al yadei mesiras shluchim. We're talking about a woman who became almona through being given over to husband's emissaries. Sha'an achshav lo pirshu lo chaksuvim elo mishpat noideres beis avio mishpat noideres beis isha. Up till now, the psukim were clear about a woman taking a vow while still in her father's domain, or still in her husband's domain, or while in her husband's domain. This case of a woman who vows en route, from the point that emissaries of the father had given her over to emissaries of the husband, Ein ani yodea hech ani korei ba. I wouldn't have known how to view her in Beis Avia, in Beis Isha. Isha means her husband. Lefikach bo kasuv ze v'lindecha. Therefore, this pasuk comes to teach us shelo tikro la Beis Avia. We're going to refer to her anymore as Beis Avia. Ella Beis Isha. She's considered in her husband's domain. V'lo nisroikna rishus lo av b'misasa shabal. And upon the death of this man, of the husband that's waiting for her, upon his death, the powers that he had are not transferred back to the father's domain. Let's read that again. Velo nisroikna rishus la'av. The stroke means that we have to do with the passing back of control over her vows to the father with the death of the husband. V'shuv eino yochel lahafer. And at that point, the father can no longer. The father at this point cannot annul her vows. Alma lo hadr lemilsa kamaisa. So we see that the original status that existed, namely girl under father's domain, does not return. The ilu nis armalo min erisin ad shelo nimsro l'shluchim Let us say she had become an almona at the erusin stage before being given over to emissaries. When the husband dies, nisrok the rishus lav, the power of a vow annulment would go back to the father. The alfinon lo mikroy, and all of that is derived from psukim. So, just to summarize, the Pasuk Neder Almona Grusha tells us that once the girl is given over to the Shluchei HaBaal, she no longer is in the father's domain, even if she becomes, as the Pasuk says, an Almona at that point where the husband dies, she remains out of the father's domain. And once out, you don't go back. And therefore, in our case before, if she was given over to the Shluchei HaBaal, and she went back to her father's house and is mizaneh, she is not going to receive skila, rather chenek. Omer Rav Papa, af anan nami tanina. We have a long point marking. The Rav Papa says we have a Mishnah that supports this as well. Habo al nara hamurasa, a person that has intimacy with a woman that's arusa to someone else. Eino chayav achte nara basula morosa v'hi beveis aviyah. And when we say Eino Chayav, means he won't be subject to skila unless all of these elements are met. She has to be Nara, Basula, Morosa, and Beveis Aviyah. So when we say Eino Chayav, we're referring to the penalty of skila, of we're dealing with someone that's committing a capital a crime, deserving of capital punishment, execution. But when we speak about Na'ar Morosa, you have to realize that deserves a special form of execution, that of stoning. Otherwise, when you're dealing with the intimacy with a married woman, the penalty is chenek, is strangulation. And now the Gemara analyzes each one of these expressions that we've labeled Aleph, Beis, Gimel, and Daled, and what each one implies. Bishlama Nara, v'lo bogeres. Very similar to what we saw earlier in today's shiur, that the word Nara, here it's in a Mishnah. We saw this also in a pasuk. But I understand the word Nara comes to exclude from skila, no skila, if the woman that you had the illicit intimacy with was a boger. She was above 12 and a half. Besula equals v'lo bula. That excludes a woman that already experienced intimacy, regardless of her age. If she's a beula, she will not generate a skila penalty. Me'orasa v'lo nisua. The word morosa indicates she's still in the state of erusin and hasn't reached nisuin. What about that expression in this Mishnah? Lav limute, is it not coming to exclude mosar ho'av l'shluchei habal? If a girl, she's an arusa, and the father gave her over to the husband's emissaries, she would not be any more the subject of skila, of a skila penalty, but rather chenek. And so that we have in this Mishnah from Masechah Sanhedrin, we have a support to the brisa that we saw before on Mem Zayin Beis, where it said Mosrav l'shulchei habal v'zin sarezu b'chenek. So that, by the way, we didn't explain before, but when Rav Papa said Afana Nami Tanina, Rashi points out that we have learned, in fact, in this Mishnah, support for the information, the teaching that was featured in that brisa back on Mem Zayin, back on Mem Ches Omid Beis. Omar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchok, Af Anan Nami Tanina. We have likewise in the Mishnah, the teaching that we saw before in the Brisa. Habo al Eishes Ish. Kevon shenichneso lirishus habal l'nisuin, a man that has intimacy with a married woman, once she enters her husband's domain for nisuin, afal pi shelo nivalo, even if she didn't have intimacy with her husband, she entered her husband's domain, but didn't have intimacy with her husband. Habo oleo hareze bechenek. Anyone that has any other man that has intimacy with her is subject to the chenek punishment. In this source, you see the expression nichneso l'rishus habal be'alma. Any form of nichneso l'rishus habal, of entrance to husband's domain. It doesn't say in this source chuppah. It doesn't say, for example, nichneso l'chuppah v'lo nivala, but rather nichneso l'rishus habal v'lo nivala. That includes the case of Mosra Ho'av l'shluchei habal, resulting in chenek, as we saw likewise in that brisa on Memches Omid Beis. So that you see in this section of Gemara, you see Rav Papa and Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak citing Mishnayos to support the brisa, which gives a great deal of strength and reliability to such a brisa. Throughout the Shas, you see from time to time the Gemara questioning the authenticity or reliability of different brisa sources. Brisas are not as authoritative as Mishnayos are, and hence when you see this expression of Afana Nami Tanina, we've learned in a Mishnah information that supports a brisa that is of value as far as the reliability of that particular brisa. So we saw that happen here twice with regard to that brisa back on Memches Omid Beis.